I'm excited about today, and I think I start off, come to think of it, every one of these by saying that I'm excited about today. But I'm actually excited about this one. I've had a slight obsession with all things Maersk for a while now. The backstory is that a couple of months ago, maybe about half a year ago, I was speaking to an investor who asked about the competitive landscape and said, well, is Maersk a competitor? And I said, of course not, they're an ocean liner. And then I started to think about it, and that led me down a long, long rabbit hole of what is happening in international freight and what is happening with ocean liners. And that particularly got me very, very interested in innovation happening internally at Maersk, specifically because it seems like Maersk is really on a path to try to question assumptions and see what else is out there, whether it's through investments, through internal development, how things can happen there. And while looking at that, I came across a couple of different people that seem to be integral to technology development, not in Maersk specifically, but within international logistics, in particular ocean freight as a whole. And that's what today is really going to be talking about. It's not going to be talking about Maersk. It's going to be talking about where is innovation really hitting the road? Where's the rubber hitting the road when it comes to different innovations, whether it's on a business model perspective or on a practical perspective. And we'll be talking about it through the context of Project Aviato, which I'll hopefully be introducing in a second. So of course, I'm Eitan Buckman. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at the Freightos Group. Peter, Sune, welcome. Maybe turn your videos off. You can unmute. There you are. Good to see you guys. Hey, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Hey, Ethan. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much. And this is, I think, the first time I've ever hosted two people at once. I know even like David Letterman usually only does one. So we'll see if I can beat him at his game. Can you guys each just maybe take 30, 45 seconds and introduce yourself and kind of your background? Let's start with you, Peter, because you're first on my screen.
Absolutely. Well, I'm here representing Project Aviato after spending 21 years of my life with Maersk, your obsession, I've just found. And yeah, I've spent a lot of time both in country management, but latest very much around transformation, where Maersk is going, and also revenue management, optimizing and pricing. So, but now I'm embarking on something new and exciting with Project Aviato.
And well, I'm the other guy, or one of three guys now, and I've been with Maersk for as long as Peter for 21 years. But at the end of last year, decided to pursue this opportunity, which we'll get to talk a bit more about during the next hour or so. My roles have been with Maersk have primarily been around radical turnarounds, managing director, CEO positions all over the world, and then since early 2017. I've been the founder or managing partner of Maersk Growth.
Fantastic. Okay, yeah, and again, if I didn't emphasize this enough, this is going to be about Project Aviato. We'll be talking about technology with some of those contexts of the collective 42 years of experience at Maersk, but definitely looking forward, not looking back here. And just a word for the audience, we're all, I think Sune, Peter, myself are all pretty chatty and open to questions. So if anything comes up, feel free to drop it in the Q&A. If we like the question, we'll get to it. And if not, we'll pretend like we didn't see it. So just a quick word about Freightos before we jump in and kind of why we're interested in this. We think a lot in terms of innovation, but also in connecting the different pieces across the supply chain, whether it's on the carriers or freight forwarders and importer side. And that gave us a lot of different context for different ways to look at the picture. And that's, of course, I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing on the ocean liner side is who's playing a role in which part of the logistics value cycle. And I know from a Maersk investment perspective, that's something that's come up a fair amount. And definitely on the transformation side, it's something that's been fairly front and center. And that's actually where I would love to start this conversation, because one thing that we're definitely seeing over the past couple of years in international freight is that connectivity is becoming much more important. The ability to connect between different types of organizations across the value chain. And I threw a couple of different examples here, some on the Maersk side and some not necessarily on the Maersk side, right? So Maersk Flow, which we'll touch on later, I'm kind of interested in that. But Maersk Spot, and really any carrier or freight forwarder, and the way that there is this focus on APIs and how can I enable interoperability for people on different sides of the value chain of international freight to connect. And that expands a little bit out to SaaS stacks as well. If you have your own ERP internally as a BCO, you're likely looking at more connectivity with freight forwarders, looking with carriers, and definitely on the last mile fulfillment side, whether it's Shopify Fulfillment Network or Walmart or Amazon, there's a very strong API first mentality and a huge ecosystem of companies that are kind of burgeoning up around those APIs. And that's my first question. And Peter, I'll start off with you, but of course, Sune, jump in if you have anything to add there. We're looking at logistics providers getting more integrated into supply chains, and that's happening on the technology side, like FBA. I think it's also happening just from a conceptual side. Like, if you look at Apple, the amount of time they spend tweaking their supply chain and definitely finding the right data to really make it work better. What is the best way, and let's look at this from the logistics provider side, what is the best way to take advantage of this shift into more digital supply chains from your perspective?
Thanks. I think, and maybe would question and actually say that in many cases, I still think it is rather conceptual. I think there's still a large space to go even deeper into the integrated supply chain. I mean, you just have to open the newspaper every single day and see that many and most large companies still don't have a good view of their supply chains on how everything is. As you say, some of the companies have tweaked it, have gone further, but there's still a way far way to go before we get to the end. But obviously, I mean, the benefits, and that's what we're also seeing in this time, are immense. Once you start understanding this, being able to take advantage of understanding what is your supply chain, how does it look, visibility, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Why is that such an important component, and how do I utilize that to give a better customer experience? I think that's where it has to start, is how do I, as a logistics provider, provide something that's unique to the customer that I'm offering? And I think there's a ton of space that's still unexplored. And there's a lot of these companies that we're seeing coming up in this space. And you mentioned some of them on the slide before, but others that are trying to address this, including the incumbents themselves.
Mm-hmm. Is that I think this would once have been considered a curse word at an organization, but at a conference. But it seems to me that a lot of international freight could potentially be commoditized, right? A 20-foot container is a 20-foot container from A to B. If you're talking about providing exceptional customer service, right? So exceptional customer service when trading a stock is probably going to be the same, for most people when trading a stock, they're going to go to Vanguard, or they'll go to Fidelity, or they'll go to whoever their broker is, and it'll work just fine. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that's where international freight is moving, to that commoditized, outstanding customer service, or more of a tailored view? And do you feel like that connectivity that I was just touching on before plays any role in that? Is that commoditizing it? Is it shifting it away to tailored personalization?
I think personalization is part of the business that's going there. If you look at shipping a box from one port to another port, I think we can all agree that that's pretty commoditized. I mean, mm-hmm. There are instances where there's a unique setup of a few carriers, but underlying that piece of the supply chain, yes, is commoditized. But if you start expanding, and that's the way we like to look at it from a supply chain perspective, obviously there's tons of room for personalization and for providing solutions that we can't provide today. And there I definitely see an ability to differentiate. And it's obviously a strategy of many of the existing incumbents, but also the newcomers into this. So there is a space that can go in there and provide a differentiated product. That no doubt. If you look pure ocean, and maybe even if it's a little bit of intermodal, that at some point would be pretty commoditized.
I think that last bit right there about kind of as you look at a 20-foot container port to port commoditized, you threw an intermodal and it gets a little bit less commoditized, and probably the more services you stack on top of it, the less commoditized it's going to be, right? Is that a fair kind of...
Correct. And even on top of that, I mean, one is the physical delivery, but also the insights that you can provide to a customer by understanding the entire his entire value chain. What are the customer's behaviors? What is the production facility? And you can start adding all those components and providing something that's truly differentiated, no doubt about that.
Cool. And from a startup perspective, right, if you're talking about the commodity, probably nobody can sell those commodities better than the ocean liners, right, or the airlines, because they're actually owning the underlying assets. Where can startups play a broader role? Like, is that on data aggregation? I'm thinking what's popping into my head right now is what people keep on writing about Peloton bikes, right? That they had to shift away from ocean shipping and suddenly start importing their bikes to the United States by air instead, paying an arm and a leg for that. Is that where you feel like the startup room to play is, like on aggregating between different services and coming up with data insights, or is it more nuanced than that?
Yeah, but I think that's one component, and I think as an aggregator, and Sune, please feel free to jump in here. But I think the obvious play is the multi-carrier strategy, providing multi-carrier solutions for customers. I mean, that's one where the carrier themselves cannot offer that, but a freight forwarder potentially could, in its instance, or a digital freight forwarder. And then I see that as more of a marketplace. And then once you take the next step down, as soon as you start adding components, obviously the complexity of the solution increases. But I mean, you know how it is to order your own ticket today. Even if you have a few stops around the world, it's doable and it's very user friendly. There's no reason why that shouldn't be the same in our space. But clearly, if you own the assets, you have an advantage because you have insight into where the cargo is the majority of the time. And I think it's that balance, is how do you get access to that data? And then how do you build something on top of that that provides value for the customer?
Mm-hmm. And Sune, I think you've probably sat through hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations from the ocean liner perspective, trying to hear startups pitch to you about where they can drive value beyond that commodity layer. Is there any theme that you kept on hearing, or a couple of themes that you kept on hearing from those startups of where they could drive value?
So I think there's probably, and maybe also, thinking, what we're looking at really achieving in Aviato is that I think the shipping lines and the carriers, they've done such an incredible work at optimizing on that port piece, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, to be frank, I think that's quite difficult to compete with in isolation as a startup. You speak a bit about the reach, and then there's some other things as well, right? So both in our previous lives, but certainly even more so in Aviato now going forward, what we are quite excited about is the stuff that happens on either side, right? So it's really sort of the end-to-end, and that's where we believe there's a very, very big difference to be done. I think that's probably also where you can really work on lifting the customer experience. It's where you can really start building that internet connectivity, the visibility, and all of these things, really stitching things up, delivering that end-to-end, service that Peter has been working on, from the inside out in his previous position, and that I and the rest of the team have been working on doing from the outside in, right? And this is essentially what we've been obsessing with the last many years. And I must say that if I was going to found my own startup today, I probably would not go after what the carriers are doing, right? I think they are very, very good at what they do. Right.
And instead, that's actually just such an easy question. So I'll flip that right back at you. Where would you actually start, right? If you were starting a startup right now, does that mean you'd go all the way? We talked about end to end before, and I don't want you to tip your hat on any or tip your cards on any investments or upcoming investments. But kind of, you just said you wouldn't want to stay on that middle layer, but you are looking at that full end to end. As you get more polarized to either end, does that become more lucrative, or is it more maybe about aggregating a lot of different companies that do the middle lane? Like, is there anywhere a particular area that's sticking out as interesting?
I mean, so if we could do whatever we wanted to do, then we would do what we're doing. We would create a fund, so we didn't have to choose, right? So rather than picking one, we can pick 30. I do think that there's definitely, I think that over time, you're definitely going to see some kind of aggregation. You're going to see some kind of roll-up, which I think is also why you're seeing some of, the private equity firms and the later stage investors beginning to come in some of the early stage stuff. But I mean, there's a lot of things we're quite excited about, right? And, we're also excited about ocean freight. Don't get me wrong. It's just very, very contested, right? And the people doing it are incredibly good at it. So I think there's a lot of, things about e-commerce, both the actual delivery, the redelivery. There's a lot of things that's one of the things we've been discussing a lot actually in Aviato the last couple of weeks, the whole re-commerce space. And the way that we really approach this is that we start looking at not so much solutions looking for a problem, but more starting with the macro trends and how's the world around us changing, right? And there's a lot of things, and I'm not going to bore the audience here with all of them, but I mean, everything like, let's call it the Amazon effect. What's that actually doing, right? How is consumer behavior changing, right? We all want to be different, so I don't want to wear the same hoodie as you are wearing. I want mine to be personalized. By the way, I don't want to wait 2 months for it, right? I want it tomorrow. I want it to deliver to my doorstep. And if I just happen not to be home when, you thought you were going to deliver and I want it to be delivered to the gym instead, you have to be able to fulfill that. So the whole omni-channel fulfillment, I think is really, really interesting. I think it's very, very exciting to see what's happening with the brands, right? That a lot of brands have probably felt that they ended up being very far from the customer. So that battle for the customer, who owns the customer, and how do you actually deliver on that promise, I think is really, really exciting. And there's a lot of other things, right, in terms of then, what kind of models does technology enable, right? I mean, with the proliferation of AI, censoring and all of that stuff, what can you do in the visibility space? What can you do in forecasting? What can you do in terms of analytics, automation, and all of these great things, right? I realize this just sounded like a game of bullshit bingo, but I think there's a lot of things we're excited about. But I think the common thing is we really start with the macro trends. We start looking at the consumer angle or the customer angle to this. What are those needs? And then how do you actually then provide for those?
Yeah, interesting. And I think that's a really good segue into Aviato as a whole. And I have to admit that the first time I heard about Aviato, it kind of went over my head. And then when I was speaking to somebody on the team, they're like, "Oh, like, are they joking? Like, is that, the Silicon Valley reference?" I was like, "Oh, now I get it." You talked a little bit about kind of the Project Aviato vision and how this is what you're really pushing for, and like why it's so fun to be able to do everything rather than one thing. At the same time, Maersk seems to be at a really interesting crossroad, right? And this is just like and Peter, this is definitely for you too. Like you've been building up that crossroad, right? Sune has been doing it from the outside in, as he said, but you've been doing it from the inside out. And I guess that means that the pull from being able to do something like this, it has to be that much more of a magnet in order to pull you out from something like that. And I guess for both of you, why? Like, is VC that interesting? Like, what is the underlying driver that pulls somebody out from the largest organization of its type that is making such a large shift? And I'd love to hear from both of you on this. Like, what could possibly pull you out from that to do this?
Do you want me to take a first stab at that, Peter, and then misrepresent both of us?
This is where we get to see if you're both aligned on your reason for starting it. If this creates like an epic explosion, then it'll be a win.
I actually think that's one of the many things we aligned on, and actually not only Peter and I, but also the other Peter who's not on the call, and a few other people that's becoming part of this, right? I think, I mean, it's clearly when you've been with a company for 21 years and you sort of made it to the top of the hill, right? And leaving your job safety and your wonderful pension and what have you behind. Of course, that's a big decision, right? But I think that you put it exactly right, and I think for us, this is not a push. It's really, really a pull, right? That we see when you look at the history and forget about venture for a second, because we realize that when people talk about venture and when they talk about funds, they have all sorts of associations about people going in and taking a huge risk, and some of them get a big payback and some don't, and so on. This is really not why we gotten into this, right? I mean, we are seeing an industry that's being transformed, both because of some of the macro trends we spoke about before. The world is around us are changing, right? Supply chains are changing, politics are changing, macroeconomics are changing, sourcing patterns and all of these things. So that puts a huge pressure on supply chains and how, all of these trends, right? then we're also sort of seeing, companies are understanding that they need to adapt, they need to transform. And when you then start looking at historically what's happened in the last couple of decades, right? You've had, different trends signifying each decade. You've had sort of different winners emerging from those, right? Mm-hmm. And we really, really believe that this is the decade where the software world really meets the supply chain world, probably even the broader industry 4.0. And this opportunity is just so amazing. And now we're not talking the opportunity for Peter and I to make a quick buck. That's never what this is about. We actually, we are fundraising at the moment. So we talk a lot about, what is it and what do we call this? And this is not what it's going to end up being. But I mean, we actually are talking about, we want to create a dynasty, right? Mm-hmm. So we want to make something that's built to last, something that over time becomes a real powerhouse, so the go-to for supply chain. Because we really, really believe that this industry and the companies within this industry, they each need a lift. Some of them are exceptionally good at a lot of things, but there's certainly also certain things that they're not, right? And we do sort of see this need for the industry to lift itself. And we really, really want to be part of contributing to that, right? And then I must just say, right, I've had amazing 21 years, and I know Peter has as well with Maersk, right? And we've been treated exceptionally well, and I'm very grateful for that. But I must also say that in my view, I haven't had as much fun as I've had the last 4 years, right? Where you're out there every single month meeting 100 startups, right? And just learning, and the energy and the innovation and the agility and the energy you derive from that, it's just exceptional, right? So I think that when we saw this opportunity, again, leaving a lot behind, a fantastic career behind, but really sort of going after something that we both are incredibly excited about. I'll get off my soapbox, Peter, and let you add to this.
Yes, it's a difficult one to follow. I love Maersk. I'll always love Maersk, and people who know me know that. And it was obviously not a decision I took lightly at all. But I think Sune hits it very well. This opportunity was there. And you get to a point also as an individual. My former boss, actually, who's still with Maersk, used to say to me, when you go through transformation, it also transforms you as an individual. And you start seeing things in a different way, and you start viewing the world in a slightly different way. And I truly believe Maersk is onto something in their transformation. Obviously, I wouldn't have been doing it for a while. But I think it was time for me to try and go out there and make something on my own. And Sune and I have obviously been talking about this. So I think this was the right time, and I have the utmost respect for Maersk. But now it's Aviato time.
Amazing. I want to join now. Just like you guys are so passionate about this, it's amazing. I think Sune, one thing that you said was that sometimes there's some companies that do a lot of different things, and there's some that are a little bit more focused, and they all need to help each other. Is this more of a kind of accelerator, or are you kind of looking at the accelerator model, or like companies that are mutually supportive of each other? Is this like a Y Combinator kind of vision? How do you see this all playing out in order to actually help more supply chain technology companies go to market?
I mean, there's only one Aviato, right? So we're not trying to be something that somebody. I mean, we actually, jokes aside, right? We do actually see a gap in the market from a knowledge perspective, and from also a funding perspective, to go in and go after. And this we have empirically been seeing, over the last 3+ years, right? When we are with Maersk, and there's a lot of things there and so on. And of course, there's a lot of benefits being part of a capture, but there's also certain drawbacks in terms of what can you go after and what can't you, and so on, right? But I think, we are really, we are seeing ourselves as a fund, right? We're a growth equity fund with a, starting sort of at what we call A and late blooming Bs, but then sort of, with the intention and capacity to follow on all the way through the series and to an exit, right? So that, let's say that's the headline, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to do this in Europe. We're going to do this in the US, so sort of create a transatlantic setting, if you will. A very, very big part of what we did when we are with Maersk, and the Peter who's not on the call here, actually, he's the architect behind this when we were Maersk Growth, is value creation. So we are, I mean, you spoke about commodities early on in a different context, but I think if there's one thing that's very commoditized in this market, it's cash, right? So we believe very, very clearly in a way to differentiate ourselves, right? And we've been spending a fair bit of time and energy understanding how do you actually, in the venture world, the growth equity world, the startup world, how do you remain relevant, right? And, you know, there's only so many Elon Musks out there, and none of us claim to be that guy. So how do you then win? And then we really gone in and we looked at, you know, dissecting the world of venture. What are the things you need to compete on? And also try to kill off this thesis that everybody is good at everything. So we've taken a sport that's essentially pretty individualistic, and we turned that into a team sport, right? And as a very, very big part of that is our underlying value creation model, which we are working now on, let's say, perfecting that or honing that, having a lot of conversations with different potential partners, particularly on the corporate side, figuring out how could they actually sort of play into that machine that we have already established in our previous lives, right? So I think that's really what we want to do. We want to go out and we want to fund amazing startups, but then we really want to help them accelerate their journey by fixing some of the hard problems that's maybe difficult for them. And you know, we are pretty operator heavy compared to a lot of the other people who invest in the space that we are in. And that's essentially because we believe that in supply chain, we actually believe that operators will beat financial investors. There's some empirical support underlying that as well.
Cool. Let's get a little bit nitty gritty about international freight. I wrote buzzwords here and then I couldn't bring myself to actually write them. So I used icons instead. But you know, going through the normal like RPA, and I'm reading my icons left to right here, but RPA, customer experience, visibility, blockchain, right? I couldn't even make myself write those things. And maybe I think, you know, the one that actually is a little bit more interesting, and you talked a little bit about sensors in general and what that does for Industry 4.0 is legibility, that suddenly so many things that weren't legible to computers are actually digitized, and that opens up just like a world of opportunities. But really for both of you, what is really going to change? Is this like right now, are we on the cusp of like small iterations for international freight? And I don't mean iterations in a derogatory manner, right? I think, you know, if you take Twill being able to sell containers that are rollable, right? I think that's an iteration, you know, maybe getting $50 off of a container if you can roll it when you book it. That's probably a welcome iteration, but that's an iterative change. Is there anything actually foundational that's changing about international freight from a technology perspective? I guess, Sune, let's start from you, but Peter, I'm also very keen on hearing your perspective too.
So I think some of the things, right, that, you know, I briefly talked about some of these macro trends that's driving things, right? And I think it's sort of important to sort of keep the causality in mind here, right? You know, because I don't think that freight will change anything. I think that the providers will have to change based on changing customer demand and you know, structural shocks like we've had with the COVID epidemic and so on, a pandemic. But I think one of the things that we actually talk a lot about between us is, and let's say that's a hope and aspiration. When you look at the tech sector, generally speaking, right? And I think sort of, you know, people seem to think about, you know, the Googles as well as very, very, very fierce competitors, and they are, but they also understand what is it you compete on. And implicitly, you don't compete on everything, right? So you find out what are the real pressure points in your industry, and that's where you need to be able to beat the hell out of your competition, right? Not compete on everything. And I think one of the things that excites me or gives me a bit of hope for the industry, if you will, is that we are beginning to see some of these collaborations that you've had in other industries for years and years and years. I think a good example is the DCSA that's working together on standards, right? I mean, that's an initiative that sort of, you know, came out of Maersk and is beginning to get some traction. And I think Thomas and his team are doing a great job there. I mean, you need some of these things, right? Peter has been very actively involved in NICEX, which I think is also one of these things that helps, right? And the early days of Maersk Growth, we incubated TradeLens, which is also getting, so I think that some of these things and understanding as a industry player and understanding as an industry, right? We can all beat each other to death, but then we're all going to be left, sprawled on the battlefield. Or we could kind of, find out, okay, let's just agree on kind of the rules of the game and the things where we're actually all stronger. And then let's find the 2-3 things that we really, really compete on. Customer experience, for instance, would probably be a good place to start. I think that's some of the things that sort of offhand to me is triggered by this question. I don't know about you, Peter.
No, I fundamentally, obviously, we've talked about this many times, Sune. But even I would go as far as to even the incremental changes are huge ahead of us. I mean, if you look at the waste that's still in the system today, a lot of it driven by this animosity and the way that the companies they go up against each other. It's pure waste. It's waste for the customer. It's waste for the companies. It just is a big drag. I think we can address some of that if we can create an environment where it's an ecosystem of teamwork and partnership. And then, yes, of course, we're competitors to a large extent. But I think there's so much potential in just cleaning up this industry. There's so much to be had. And I think if you just look at the numbers, there's tons there. So I think we have a period of that, and then more fundamentally, a shakeup in the sense of what does the future ecosystem look at? Is that asset providers that own a piece of it? Is it an Amazon, or what is it that it looks like, right?
Yeah.
We'll see.
That was literally like the next things on my head that I was going to ask, actually. Sorry, Sune, for just 1 second, where that, you're talking about kind of creating the battlefield, like, trying to draw the borders. I don't know if it's a battlefield or a collaboration field, but for me, it seems like the borders are so porous, right? Like, you could right now be a Maersk competing with an Amazon, competing with a small digital freight company, competing with a 3D printing company. Like, what isn't freight and what is freight? Right? I just feel like it all kind of intermingles, and certainly Sune, on the Maersk Growth side, you could see this as well with investments in sourcing companies, right? Ways to source fashion better, and just like everything just kind of becomes so blurred. I'm curious, like, do you feel like there's even a distinction between freight companies and non-freight companies, and are companies going to be able to survive going forward by purely being logistics companies?
I think that depends a lot on how you define yourself and how do you define your customers, and not to sound like a big cliche, but how do you define your mission, right, or your purpose in life, right? So you're right that in the Maersk Growth world, right, we invest in a couple of companies where you're saying, well, that doesn't sound like something that the integrator of container logistics should be doing, right? But I think the company you're referring to is probably Carla, which has the mission of democratizing fast fashion. When you then start looking at the segments and sort of what historically, where's the growth and stuff like that, then I think it actually sort of starts making sense. Of course, it's a long bet, and it's not something that's going to happen today or tomorrow. But could you, 10 years out from now, could you see, coming back to some of the integrations that Peter spoke about earlier, could you see some of the logistics providers actually sort of stepping a step back, integrating closer into the manufacturing, because you have a huge visibility gap when you start going back then, and not seeing, well, there's something called manufacturing, then there's something called supply chain, then there's something called sales. Why do those universes have to be different, right? I mean, if you also, why can I not interact with this T-shirt in the same way in my factory as I do when it's in the container, when it's in the warehouse, when it's in the shop? And by the way, when it's then being returned because it's too small or it's worn and needs to be recycled. And I think there's a lot of these things around that whole space, right? And then I think I think it starts becoming problematic when you think you can win in every single arena, and when you think that you're the best at every single thing. That's when I start becoming concerned. Right.
I totally hear that. I want to move on to I think my last major question here. One thing that definitely has been happening in the B2B, and Peter, this is more I think for you. One thing that's definitely been happening on the B2B technology space is that even companies that are trying to be transactional, right, that are trying to sell goods, will typically fall back on some type of SaaS-enabled go-to-market model, right? So when Freightos first started, we provided rate management to freight forwarders prior to letting them sell in a marketplace. In other industries, OpenTable, which started by selling SaaS software to restaurants before creating an online marketplace for restaurant booking. And I think that SaaS first transformation model, and I could be totally wrong, but that kind of seems like what the Maersk Flow potential play is. Can you, I know that you were pretty intrinsically involved in Maersk Flow. Can you just give like a quick download? Maybe this is more for me than any of the 100 plus people on the call, but a quick download on what is Maersk Flow and how does that actually play, or how does that type of model play into go-to-market? Oh wait, you're still muted. Wait, Peter, you're still muted, which might be intentional. I don't know.
Sorry. I'm sure. As I was saying, I'm sure there's some Maersk people on the line that potentially could even better explain it. But if you think about it again, it's in essence supply chain in a box. It's making it easier for the small and medium-sized customers out there that have been reliant on going to a freight forwarder or going to a shipping line or any other logistics provider to give them this service. And again, I don't want to speak to what's happened after I left, but there's no doubt that there was a very strong uptake and the very strong demand for this product when it was launched, because it was something that wasn't accessible and easily accessible for many customers. So I believe it's a very strong model to get them. It's also about lifting the industry and the industry knowledge and the capabilities within the industry, because I think I also believe a lot in democratizing a lot of what we do in the flows, because today a lot of the opaqueness that's in the market is something that's driven by the many players in the market, the many forwarders in the market, and even the carriers to an extent in the market. And I think that needs to be eradicated over time, so it becomes easy for the customers out there to go in and pick a model that suits their needs. And then it'll be iterations of that type of model that will be the winner in the future, because obviously the something like Maersk Flow is something you take off the table. Once you grow and once your requirements, they change, you will need a layer on top of that to be able to actually manage and transact. But coming off and you're starting up, I think it's a tremendously great model, and there are others out there that also are good.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting model, and certainly from a VC perspective, you typically see this more from smaller companies that want to punch up, right? That are trying to capture more market share, and it's an interesting play to see it kind of coming from a large player trying to punch down almost and try to reach. I guess take the things that are already transactional, try to turn it into SaaS. So maybe it's like a transactional enabled SaaS. I don't know if that's even a model that exists. It's definitely interesting. I'm seeing a question come in from that's actually really interesting about commoditization. And it's a very long question. I want to try to summarize it right now, which is that the commoditization, which we just discussed, and the ability to create standards like DCSA and IATA One Record are doing, don't that equally stand a chance of kind of giving the large players a leg up? And if there are standards and just the larger players can go in and dominate using those standards and really kind of squash any innovation coming from smaller companies. Do either of you feel like that's a potential risk from standardization where it just kind of lets the large players run free?
It's obviously a difficult question, Ethan, and I think we're in an industry right now that with no standards or very, very few. I think there's an upside, irrespective of gaining a certain set of standards, because right now what it does is it creates a race to the bottom, and that impacts service levels and impacts customer promises. I mean, you just look at the situation right now in ocean freight. There's a lot of reasons why it is what it is, but I think certain standards and that you can rely on this is how it is beneficial. Whether it gets to a stage of big tech that we know it today, that's pure speculation. But let's just say, in my view, we're very, very far away from that today. And and you know how it is. If you don't do it, then every carrier, every forwarder, everybody's going to create their own standard, and in the end, that's not going to be beneficial. So I believe very much that we need to go through a process of bringing standards to the industry.
Great. And another good question coming in, a lot of people talk about providing better customer service and driving value, right? And it's kind of a race to drive more value to BCOs. Do either of you have perspectives on what real value is? Like if we have to translate that into a concrete features or value propositions, what is the real value that BCOs can actually be provided with today?
Do you want to take a stab at that, Peter?
Yeah, I can, but it's also, I mean, please jump in. I think for me, as you say, it changes over time, and each BCO is not born equal. You could say the respective needs of one BCO in a certain segment selling a certain piece of business or doing something is different. So I think it's this understanding and personalizing the solutions based on the customer segment or the customer type is what's going to be the differentiator. Understanding that entire flow of what it is they're competing on and how they become the best. I think that's really the key. So there's no one answer that's going to answer this. For some, it's basic visibility. For others, it's pure and strong insights into where do my goods sell best now. So insights into the supply chain so that they can uniquely and position it around. Sune referred to it before, saying why is there a difference from when it's in the factory, from when it's in the container until it's actually sitting there. So I think it really is dependent, and that's probably what you're going to see is more personalization.
And I think that's also what Sune was speaking to before about just in general that not trying to be maybe I'm saying this instead of Sune, but not trying to solve every problem for everyone. Just recognizing that different values for different people and just finding your right audience and helping whatever they think their value actually is. We have just a couple minutes to wrap up, so I just want to go through some really quick questions. I think we answered this one about why you guys think you can do VC funding differently, so let's pass that one. What relationship, this is an interesting one, and maybe Peter, this is more you. What relationship do you think medium and small freight forwarders should expect with ocean carriers besides uneasy?
I mean, fundamentally, I believe that any freight forwarder that can provide added value above upselling on ocean freight, that's valuable for the customer will have a place. I just don't think the times of just upselling freight is over, and I think it's going to depend on how good these respective forwarders find pockets of areas where they can provide value to the customers that a digital solution or the carrier can't do themselves. That's really my take on it, whether it's specialized services or what it is. But that's how I see it.
Perfect. Sune, do you have anything else to add on that, or are you signing off on that answer too?
No, I think to me it ties back a bit with what you also spoke about before, right? I mean, I think that the days of being able to take money off the table for providing no value are probably soon over, right? And I think that's a little bit, and I think it comes into that sort of whole data integration piece as well, right? That obviously the big girls and boys they're going to raise the stakes. And that means that people are sort of sitting very, very comfortably before and making very, very easy money. They're going to be in trouble, right? But there's obviously going to be plenty of opportunities. And I think we really want to look at change to this industry, right? I mean, some of these, standards and so on, I mean, they need to increase, right? Because otherwise we are not really, just having somebody who makes a lot of money by removing a little bit of friction that the industry has caused on itself. I don't really think that gets us anywhere. So I think the stakes are raised, but I think ultimately, I think that's much better for the planet, but for the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Moving on to probably my most important question, and saying this is when I ran my 2020 numbers, I found that I had over 500 slices of pizza last year, and I was quite proud of myself. So I guess for both of you, favorite pizza topping?
Parma ham.
Awesome. Sune?
Yeah, I'm gonna go for pepperoni. Probably on a second thought, that's probably my son's favorite pizza, but I normally end up with his leftovers. So.
I'm just a plain cheese guy. I don't know. I always feel a little bit sad about this. All right, let's finish up with this question. which I definitely see this both on the growth side and on the digital transformation side. It's hard to stay agile no matter what size of a company you are. Both of you within your kind of, and I'm sure you're feeling, I think probably feeling a little bit freer now that you're not part of a large corporation, but even within a larger corporation, it seems like a certain degree of agility was still preserved for individual business units. And I'm wondering if either of you have any insights for larger organizations that are on the call that are trying to kind of recreate the ability to remain agile and move really, really quickly. Any insights, tips, words of advice on that?
I mean, from a transformational perspective, you'll hear me say it 1,000 and thousands of times. It's about the culture. It's about the mindset. That's the one that trumps everything else. You can invest in tech. You can invest in everything. If you're not willing to make that change and change fundamentally the way you think about approaching work and approaching what does the market look like? Where is it that I want to play? And most importantly, what kind of capabilities do I need as a large incumbent company to be able to compete in the market that I want to compete in? I mean, having that understanding and then basically having a massive uplift of that, both from people from outside, but also within the company, is the most crucial thing. And it's all the way from the basics of how you set up your remuneration structures, so the structural limits around it, to the way of talking, the way of working that need to change for the incumbents to stay agile. And then it requires strong leadership support and strong leadership. It comes down to the leaders getting up in front and saying, this is where we're going and this is how we're going to get there, and then bringing people along with that journey. Because there's a reason why these companies have gotten to where they are today. So there's tons of talent, there's tons of culture. You have to use what makes them good and then lift it even further. That's how I see it.
Just maybe very practically so one of the last things that Peter and I collectively achieved, and sort of on our last couple of months with Maersk, where we said, okay, this is something we're really going to lean into. It's actually something we started a bit more than a year earlier, so in early 19. In the early days of Maersk Growth, I'd been trying to get innovation as a capability off the ground, right? So now we're talking like 2017, and the company, the culture that Peter speaks about wasn't ready. And then sort of the people working with me, and this ended up being a little bit frustrated. We then parked it. But then 2 years later, at the end of 19, we actually said, well, let's give this another try, because that's probably the best thing we can do for the longevity of the company, right? We can go out and we can find, a lot of wonderful startups, but what really, really moves the needle, right? Can you actually sort of start shifting the culture? And so Peter and I actually leaned into this as executive sponsors. We hired somebody from the outside to run this. And between our team, so Peter's transformation team and the Maersk Growth team, we actually started getting this. And to be frank, I mean, the first 6 months of this into 2020, pretty tough start, and nobody's really interested. And then something really began to happen, right? That then we are beginning to create this grassroots movement, and which really, really started being fueled. And that forward momentum, continued. So that's actually one of the last few things that we both really, really leaned into before we left, to make sure that took off the ground. And I mean, today if you follow LinkedIn, there's a lot of being written about that. Maersk launched something with Gary Hamel around this and this whole innovation community. And I think those kind of initiatives is some of the stuff, right? And what we often heard is people coming and saying, oh, but and this is a problem, and this is a problem. And they said, well, but do something about it, right? Mm-hmm. And then the community actually into hacking these problems and, saying, because, one thing is you definitely, as Peter has, I mean, it starts with the leadership. The leadership has to embrace this. The leadership has to facilitate it. One of the things that Sabrina, that is today leading this initiative within Maersk, the way she used to speak about this, that leaders, they need to go from being decision makers to becoming choice facilitators, which is something that actually sits really, really well with me. This choice facilitation, right? And I think that it's very, very rewarding to sit and follow this much more from the sideline than I used to. Mm-hmm. But actually seeing that this is actually moving forward. 4 years ago, this has been possible in Maersk, and now it's happening. And it's happening from the grassroots, which is amazing.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much. This was really interesting, and I appreciate you both taking the time. Best of luck on Project Aviato. And I'm sure if there's any startups listening to us talk right now, I'm sure you guys would be pretty happy to hear from them.
Absolutely.
So, perfect. All right. So look them both up on LinkedIn. Both pretty talkative, friendly people. Guys, thank you so much. This was really interesting. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for everybody for listening in and the great questions.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. And for everybody, thank you for tuning in. We have a couple of really, really great sessions coming up down the line, talking to some other major ocean liners, some other interesting aspects on the technology side from some LCL consolidators. So tune into the next episode. Sune, Peter, have a great day. Thanks, everybody, and have a good one.